April 18th, 1945. The Ruhr industrial region, Western Germany. Imagine over 500,000 battle-hardened German soldiers, warriors who'd endured the frozen nightmare of Stalingrad, survived the apocalyptic carnage of Kursk, and fought tooth and nail through the blood-soaked hedgerows of Normandy, standing at a crossroads that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. These weren't fresh-faced conscripts or war-weary garrison troops. These were combat veterans with years of frontline experience etched into their souls. And yet, they were about to make a collective decision that would shock the world: mass surrender to American forces rather than continue fighting or attempt to break through to German lines. But here's what makes this moment truly spine-chilling. What the Americans had unleashed upon them wasn't merely superior firepower or overwhelming numbers. No, they'd perfected something far more psychologically devastating. A systematic, methodical approach to warfare that transformed resistance from an act of courage into a mathematical impossibility. Fighting back wasn't just difficult or costly, it had become functionally pointless. Let me transport you back to where this unprecedented collapse began. 6 a.m., eastern bank of the Rhine River, Lippstadt sector. Field Marshal Walter Model, one of Hitler's most trusted commanders, stood in his makeshift command headquarters, staring at tactical maps that told a story his trained military mind deemed operationally impossible. The papers spread before him detailed something that German military doctrine considered theoretically implausible. In merely 12 days, American armored spearheads had achieved the complete strategic encirclement of an entire army group. Think about the sheer magnitude of what that means. Over 325,000 frontline combat troops, plus tens of thousands of logistics personnel, supply units, stragglers, and attached forces, bringing the total to more than 430,000 men, now found themselves trapped within a roughly 50-mile-wide pocket of German territory. Cut off, surrounded, isolated from reinforcement or resupply. But wait, because those staggering numbers themselves weren't what made this moment historically unprecedented. German armies had been encircled before throughout the war. Stalingrad, where an entire German army was annihilated. Falaise, where tens of thousands were captured or killed. Countless smaller encirclements across the eastern and western fronts. So encirclement warfare wasn't revolutionary or new to German military experience. So what made the Ruhr Pocket fundamentally, catastrophically different from every previous encirclement? It was what happened next. Or more precisely, what didn't happen next. There were no desperate all-or-nothing breakout attempts. No fanatical last stands defended until the final bullet was expended. No suicidal resistance honoring the Nazi ideology of fighting to the death. Instead, over the subsequent 14 days, the Western Front would witness the largest mass capitulation in its entire history. An event so shocking, it would send shockwaves through both Allied and German commands. And here's what genuinely terrified the German High Command. More than any weapon, bomb, or tactical innovation, their battle-hardened soldiers had fundamentally stopped believing that resistance meant anything anymore. The psychological foundation of military effectiveness had simply evaporated. The Americans had a clinical, technical term for their operational strategy: vertical envelopment. But that sterile military jargon concealed a genuine revolution in combined arms warfare, a systematized approach refined through 3 years of brutal combat experience stretching from the scorching deserts of North Africa to the muddy banks of the Rhine. Major General J. Lawton Collins, commanding the U.S. 7th Corps, had pioneered a revolutionary approach to modern warfare that didn't merely defeat or overcome German defensive positions. It made the psychological act of defending them utterly unsustainable. Consider what German soldiers trapped in the Ruhr had been told repeatedly for years through propaganda and military briefings. American forces were soft, inexperienced, combat-averse. They were overly reliant on overwhelming material advantages rather than genuine tactical skill or warrior spirit. German propaganda confidently assured them that Teutonic tactical brilliance and superior martial determination would inevitably triumph over American industrial muscle and materialism. And these weren't hollow promises fed to naive teenagers. Army Group B contained legitimate Eastern Front veterans, hardened survivors of Kursk and Kiev, professional soldiers who intimately understood encirclement warfare from brutal personal experience. Many had successfully broken through Soviet encirclements before. They knew the doctrine, the tactics, the techniques of pocket warfare. Yet here's the shocking reality. Within mere days of the pocket's formation, entire German divisions, thousands of combat-ready troops, began surrendering without firing a single defensive shot. By April 18th, when Model officially dissolved Army Group B and released his soldiers from their military oaths of loyalty, over 317,000 had already laid down their weapons. When American forces finally cleared the entire pocket on April 21st, they'd processed 325,000 official prisoners of war. But here's the kicker that makes those numbers even more staggering. When you factor in all the Luftwaffe ground personnel, Waffen-SS units, Volkssturm militia, and scattered paramilitary forces throughout the industrial Ruhr region, total captures likely exceeded 500,000 men. 500,000 combat-experienced soldiers choosing surrender. So what exactly had these battle-tested German troops encountered that shattered their will to resist so completely? Not, conventional army in any traditional military sense. What they faced was something unprecedented in military history, an integrated, systematic mechanism of destruction operating on operational principles they'd never confronted before. Not from the numerically superior Soviets, not from the British with their desert warfare expertise, not in any previous theater of this global war. The Americans had developed what military scholars would later identify as a fundamental evolutionary leap in warfare itself. The operational capacity to render continued military resistance not merely difficult, dangerous, or expensive in casualties, but functionally, strategically meaningless. And here's the terrifying part. The weapon wasn't any single technological breakthrough or secret innovation. It was the seamless, flawless integration of total air superiority, mechanized armored warfare, artillery dominance, logistics mastery, intelligence superiority, and psychological operations into one relentless, self-reinforcing machine of war. This machine didn't just degrade German combat effectiveness or inflict casualties. It systematically crushed the German psychological will to continue fighting. Each operational component amplified and reinforced the others, creating a cascading, compounding effect where every passing hour of resistance became more obviously futile than the previous one. In his final operational message before formally dissolving Army Group B, Model wrote something that still haunts military historians today. The Americans don't fight battles in any conventional sense. They conduct systematic industrial operations. Our men aren't facing an army, they're facing an integrated system. Personal courage, tactical brilliance, warrior spirit, all become operationally meaningless when the enemy can anticipate your every tactical decision, counter your every operational action, and render your defensive position untenable before you even fully occupy it. 3 weeks after writing those words, Model walked alone into the forests near Duisburg and took his own life with his service pistol. He left no formal suicide note, but his personal aide documented Model's final spoken words. "A German field marshal does not surrender to the enemy, and I cannot order my men to do something I myself am unwilling to do." But his men had already made their choice. And here's what's crucial to understand. Not because they were cowards or lacked martial spirit. Let me be absolutely crystal clear about that historical point. They chose surrender because they'd grasped a terrible truth that their commanders refused to psychologically acknowledge. The Americans had created an evolutionary form of warfare where traditional military virtues, individual courage, tactical genius, iron determination, fighting spirit, had become operationally and strategically irrelevant to the battle's outcome. You couldn't outfight a systematic military machine that had already calculated and prepared responses for every possible tactical decision you might make. You couldn't operationally outmaneuver forces that dominated every avenue of approach through total air superiority and mechanized mobility. You couldn't outlast an adversary whose supply chain stretched thousands of uninterrupted miles back across an ocean to an untouched industrial heartland producing war materials at incomprehensible scales. The Ruhr Pocket isn't really a story about a conventional military battle or tactical engagement. It's about the exact historical moment when industrial age, systematized warfare, reached its cold, inevitable, logical endpoint. The moment when one side's methodological approach made the opposing side's continued military resistance not just strategically impossible, but fundamentally, philosophically pointless. 500,000 German soldiers didn't surrender because they'd been tactically defeated in combat engagements. They surrendered because they'd been rendered operationally obsolete by an evolved form of warfare. Now, here's the deeply ironic historical twist that makes this story even more compelling. The German military doctrine that failed so utterly, so catastrophically, in April 1945, had actually been born from spectacular, unprecedented military success. For 5 consecutive years from 1939 to 1944, the Wehrmacht had conquered virtually an entire continent using operational principles that had proven devastatingly, historically effective. Operational speed, concentration of overwhelming force at decisive points, tactical flexibility and adaptability, superior training of individual soldiers and small unit combat leaders. The Germans had a specific doctrinal term for this. Auftragstaktik, mission-oriented tactics. Military commanders at every organizational level understood the broader operational objective and possessed the authority and training to achieve it through their own creative tactical initiative and battlefield improvisation. This meant a German lieutenant could rapidly adapt to dynamically changing battlefield conditions, faster than an American colonel could even receive updated operational orders transmitted from division headquarters through multiple communication layers. This radically decentralized command philosophy enabled German forces to consistently, repeatedly outmaneuver numerically and materially superior opponents throughout the early war years. Poland in 1939, crushed in weeks. France in 1940, defeated in 6 weeks despite military parity. The Balkans, overrun. The initial phases of Operation Barbarossa against the Soviet Union, spectacular advances. The system had worked brilliantly, repeatedly, consistently. German soldiers received extensive, comprehensive training far exceeding Allied standards. Even basic infantrymen received military education that emphasized independent tactical thinking and situational awareness rather than rote obedience. German squad leader wielded more tactical authority and possessed more comprehensive training than many Allied platoon or even company commanders. This created an organizational military culture where small combat groups could achieve disproportionate battlefield results through superior individual skill, tactical initiative, and battlefield improvisation. Even by 1943, despite mounting casualties and increasingly desperate strategic circumstances, German tactical doctrine continued producing locally impressive results against Allied forces. At Kasserine Pass in Tunisia during February 1943, relatively modest German forces inflicted genuinely humiliating defeats on American units in their first major combat engagement of the North African campaign. The Germans demonstrated conclusively that even when significantly outnumbered and outgunned in terms of material resources, superior tactical doctrine and veteran battlefield leadership could overcome substantial material disadvantages. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, commanding Allied forces in North Africa, was forced to fundamentally restructure American combat training and military doctrine after the Kasserine debacle. The operational lessons were painful, humiliating, but strategically undeniable. American forces required radical, comprehensive changes in their tactical approach to modern warfare. Raw physical courage and overwhelming industrial output weren't operationally sufficient against a professional enemy who could consistently outthink and outmaneuver American forces at the small unit tactical level. But, and this is the absolutely crucial strategic pivot point, the Germans made a catastrophic miscalculation about the fundamental nature of modern warfare's evolution. They assumed that warfare would continue to be primarily decided by these tactical small unit engagements. That battles would ultimately be won by the side with better tactical training, quicker battlefield decision cycles, and more skillfully led individual soldiers at the squad and platoon level. What they completely failed to grasp, what they couldn't conceptually process, was that the Americans were playing an entirely different strategic game on a completely different operational level. While German military doctrine remained intensely focused on winning individual tactical engagements and small unit battles, American military doctrine was systematically evolving towards something unprecedented in military history: operational-level dominance that would make individual tactical encounters largely strategically irrelevant to the campaign's ultimate outcome. The Americans weren't desperately trying to win individual tactical battles through superior small-unit tactics or soldier training. They were methodically constructing an integrated, systematic approach that would make the outcomes of individual tactical battles fundamentally meaningless to operational success. Between 1943 and 1945, the United States military underwent a comprehensive organizational transformation that had absolutely no historical parallel in military history. This wasn't primarily about creating individually better trained soldiers, though American combat training did improve dramatically after Kasserine. It was about creating an integrated operational system where individual tactical decisions and small unit battlefield performance mattered progressively less than systematic operational superiority at the campaign level. The scale of American logistical preparation was something the German military literally couldn't conceptualize or comprehend. By early 1945, American forces operating in Western Europe were supported by a supply network that delivered 26,000 tons of military supplies daily. Every single American division crossing the Rhine had immediate artillery support capable of delivering more explosive tonnage in 1 hour than an entire German corps could fire during an entire day of combat. But logistics alone don't fully explain the psychological collapse that occurred in the Ruhr Pocket. Consider this crucial comparison. The Soviets possessed enormous, overwhelming material superiority on the Eastern Front throughout 1944-1945. Yet German forces continued fighting with desperate, fanatical determination, even in obviously hopeless tactical situations. At Budapest, German and Hungarian forces held out for 50 days in a siege that ended in near-complete annihilation. At Breslau, the garrison fought for 82 days, continuing suicidal resistance even after Hitler's confirmed death and Germany's unconditional surrender. Against the Soviets, that same martial determination, that willingness to fight to the death, persisted. Against the Americans in the Ruhr, that determination evaporated within days. The difference wasn't firepower or material superiority alone. It was operational predictability and strategic inevitability. American operational doctrine had evolved into something the Germans called Materialschlacht, the material battle. But that German term failed to capture what made the American approach psychologically, not just tactically, devastating. The Americans had systematically developed an approach where every German tactical action triggered a predetermined, overwhelming multi-domain response executed with machine-like efficiency. Artillery forward observers called in precision fire missions within mere minutes of target identification. Close air support appeared overhead within an hour. Mechanized tank columns maneuvered to cut off withdrawal routes before German commanders even fully realized their forward positions had been compromised. And here's what made this approach truly revolutionary. It wasn't that Americans were brilliantly predicting German tactical moves through superior intelligence gathering or exceptional battlefield generalship. They simply possessed sufficient resources and systematic organization to prepare simultaneous responses for every tactical possibility at once. Colonel General Alfred Jodl, operations chief of the German Armed Forces High Command, OKW, wrote in his personal diary in March 1945, "Against the Americans, our celebrated tactical doctrine has become a psychological prison. Every operational principle that served us brilliantly against the Poles, French, and even initially against the Soviets now works systematically against us. Our tactical flexibility means nothing when the enemy has prepared overwhelming responses to every possible option. Our battlefield initiative becomes meaningless when every action triggers immediate, disproportionate retaliation. We are fighting an opponent who doesn't need to intellectually outthink us. They've made tactical thinking operationally irrelevant." This was the operational and psychological context that Army Group B entered when American forces completed their Rhine crossings. They brought tactical excellence, veteran combat leadership, and iron determination to a military confrontation where none of those traditional qualities mattered anymore. They had prepared psychologically and doctrinally for a conventional battle. What they encountered instead was an industrial process systematically designed to make conventional battle impossible. The German defensive preparations in the Ruhr represented the culmination of 5 years of hard-won, blood-bought tactical knowledge accumulated across multiple fronts. Army Group B wasn't a hastily assembled collection of green recruits or demoralized garrison troops. It contained elite, proven formations, the 116th Panzer Division, hardened veterans of the Normandy campaign, the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division, which had fought through both the Italian and French campaigns, the 338th Infantry Division, survivors of the brutal Eastern Front. These weren't soldiers who broke easily under pressure. General Günther Blumentritt, commanding 1st Parachute Army within the Pocket, had personally overseen comprehensive defensive preparations throughout January and February 1945. His meticulous planning documents, captured after the surrender, revealed extraordinary attention to tactical lessons learned through 3 years of continuous retreat across Europe. Every defensive position had been carefully sited with interlocking fields of fire. Every bridge spanning the numerous rivers and canals had demolition charges professionally placed. Every strategic crossroad had been pre-registered for immediate artillery strikes. Every likely American approach route had multiple prepared defensive positions in depth. The Ruhr industrial region itself provided substantial natural defensive advantages to the defenders. The area contained over 4,000 factories, countless deep mine shafts, and dense urban areas absolutely perfect for protracted defensive warfare. The terrain was broken by multiple rivers, industrial canals, and massive factory complexes that naturally channeled any attacking force into predictable, defensible approach routes. German combat engineers had spent months meticulously preparing fortified positions designed to transform each factory complex, each urban city block, each river crossing into a carefully prepared killing ground for advancing American forces. Intelligence assessments captured from German divisional headquarters clearly demonstrated they thoroughly understood American operational capabilities. They knew about overwhelming American artillery superiority. German doctrine explicitly called for immediate tactical dispersal whenever American forward observers were spotted. They knew about devastating American air power. They planned major operations during poor weather conditions and prepared extensively camouflaged, covered positions. They knew about American mechanized armor tactics. They prepared sophisticated anti-tank positions in depth, with carefully planned fallback and withdrawal routes. What made German commanders genuinely confident wasn't ignorance of American material strength. It was unshakable faith in time-tested, proven defensive military doctrine, refined through years of hard combat experience. The German Manual for Positional Defensive Warfare, refined through years of brutal fighting, dictated that a properly prepared defensive position held by determined, well-trained troops could inflict casualties at ratios of 3 to 5 attackers for every single defender lost. The mathematics seemed strategically simple, even obvious. Even if Americans possessed 3.1 numerical superiority, attacking directly into professionally prepared defenses should theoretically produce unsustainable casualty rates that would force operational pauses. But every single assumption embedded in German defensive planning contained a fatal conceptual flaw. They had prepared mentally and materially for a conventional battle. They had calculated expected outcomes for combat operations where tactical decisions genuinely mattered, where terrain provided measurable advantage, where determination and skill could offset material inferiority. They had constructed a fortress designed to withstand siege warfare as understood by military traditions stretching back centuries through European military history. What they absolutely couldn't prepare for was an opponent who had evolved completely beyond conventional battle concepts entirely. The Americans hadn't come to fight for control of the Ruhr in any traditional military sense. They had come to systematically process it, and the fundamental difference between those two operational concepts, fighting versus processing, would become devastatingly clear within hours of the encirclement's completion. April 5, 1945. 8:30 a.m. First full operational day of the completed encirclement. The American system activated with machine-like precision. American P-38 Lightning reconnaissance aircraft began flying precise grid patterns over the Kursk entire pocket at carefully timed intervals. Every photographic pass was numerically catalogued. Photo interpretation specialists at Nike's Tactical Air Command headquarters received developed reconnaissance film within 2 hours of each mission. They weren't looking for tanks or troop concentrations specifically. They were systematically mapping every German position, every unit movement, every supply dump, creating a continuously updated, living operational picture of the entire defensive network. By 2:00 p.m., the first clear patterns had emerged. German units were repositioning forces to defend the most obvious American approach routes exactly as their doctrine dictated they should. American intelligence officers marked these positions on master operational maps and calculated something the Germans couldn't anticipate: the precise timing of German tactical movements. At 4:00 p.m., American artillery began firing concentrated bombardments on roads and intersections, not where German troops currently were, but where they would be in 30 minutes based on observed movement patterns and doctrinal predictions. German commanders reported to Army Group B headquarters that American artillery fire seemed to uncannily predict their tactical movements. They adjusted their approach, moving at different times, using alternate routes. American photo reconnaissance documented these tactical changes within hours. American artillery adjusted their fire plans accordingly within the same operational day. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. German after-action reports from those first critical days repeatedly use words like uncanny and unnatural. American artillery fire seemed to anticipate every tactical movement with supernatural accuracy. Units that repositioned under cover of darkness found themselves under concentrated artillery fire at their new locations within hours of arrival. Supply columns that changed routes discovered American fighter bombers waiting at alternate crossroads as if they'd been expected. It wasn't superior intelligence gathering in the traditional espionage sense. It was systematic aerial observation creating predictive operational patterns that made German tactical movements transparent. April 12, 1945. The psychological cascade began in earnest. What started as localized tactical defeats rapidly transformed into comprehensive systemic collapse within the German command structure. The breaking point wasn't any single dramatic engagement or decisive battle. It was the cumulative psychological realization that continued military resistance served absolutely no strategic purpose whatsoever. American intelligence teams, working with captured German communications equipment, documented this psychological collapse in real time through radio intercepts. Intercepted transmissions from German divisional headquarters revealed a consistent, repeating pattern. Initial tactical confidence, followed by operational confusion, then mounting desperation, finally resignation and acceptance. By April 14th, entire German battalions, thousands of combat-ready soldiers, were surrendering en masse without American forces even approaching their defensive positions. They simply walked out of their carefully prepared fortifications and waited to be processed as prisoners of war. The 9th Panzer Division provides perhaps the clearest, most documented example of this psychological collapse. On April 10th, the division reported full combat operational readiness, 47 fully operational tanks, 4,200 combat-effective troops, adequate ammunition and supplies. Division Commander General Harold von Elverfeldt issued aggressive operational orders for immediate counterattacks to restore German defensive lines. On April 13th, after only 3 days attempting to execute these offensive operations, von Elverfeldt transmitted to Army Group B headquarters. Every tactical movement draws immediate, accurate artillery fire. Every concentration of forces draws devastating air attack within an hour. We advance 500 meters. American mechanized armor appears on our flanks before we can consolidate. We cannot maneuver effectively. We can only die in static positions or surrender. On April 15th, von Elverfeldt formally surrendered his entire division with 38 tanks still fully operational and ammunition supplies sufficient for 2 more days of sustained combat operations. When interrogated by American intelligence officers, he stated bluntly, "I surrendered not because we were tactically defeated in battle, but because continued fighting had become systematic murder. I could achieve absolutely nothing except the pointless deaths of my remaining men." The industrial dimension of American warfare manifested in ways German soldiers found genuinely incomprehensible based on their previous combat experience. American units that suffered casualties received trained replacements within days through systematic rotation policies. Equipment losses, tanks, vehicles, weapons, were replaced overnight from massive supply depots. Ammunition expenditure that would have operationally crippled a German division for weeks was considered routine, standard operating procedure by American logistical standards. Get this stark comparison. The 3rd Armored Division alone fired more artillery shells on April 13th than the entire German pocket fired during the entire week combined. But the most psychologically devastating aspect wasn't material superiority or overwhelming firepower. It was the methodical, machine-like inevitability of the American advance. American forces advanced on predictable, published operational schedules. They pushed forward exactly as far as their meticulously planned supply lines would support, then paused briefly to consolidate gains before resuming. They didn't rush forward recklessly, didn't take unnecessary tactical risks, didn't provide opportunities for Germans, counterattacks, or tactical victories. They simply ground forward like an industrial machine, impersonal, inexorable, utterly unstoppable. German soldiers began calling it Walzenkrieg, steamroller war. There was no glory in it, no opportunity for individual heroism or martial distinction, no tactical way for personal courage or professional skill to matter operationally. You couldn't ambush a steamroller. You couldn't outmaneuver it. You could only wait for it to reach your position and then be crushed, or step aside. By April 16th, American forces had processed over 150,000 prisoners through systematic assembly line procedures. The supply infrastructure for handling mass surrenders had become as sophisticated and efficient as combat operations themselves. Field Marshal Model's headquarters maintained communications until April 17th. His final operational orders revealed a commander who understood the situation completely, but couldn't bring himself to psychologically accept its implications. He authorized unit commanders to surrender independently if they judged continued resistance militarily pointless, effectively dissolving his command while refusing to formally capitulate himself. On April 21st, the last organized German resistance in the pocket ceased entirely. Final official prisoner counts exceeded $325,000, the largest mass surrender in Western Front history. American casualties during the entire operation? 10,000 wounded, 2,000 killed. German casualties? Approximately 10,000 killed in combat. The rest captured. For brutal historical context, consider the Eastern Front. In the Ruhr Pocket, 200,000 German soldiers held out against Soviet forces until the war's end, suffering over 150,000 casualties, but never surrendering en masse. At Heiligenbeil, German forces fought for 2 months with 80% casualties before final defeat. Against the Soviets, Germans fought literally to annihilation. Against the Americans, they chose survival. Post-war studies by both American and German military historians identified the Ruhr Pocket as the precise historical moment when industrial warfare reached its cold, logical conclusion. The Americans had created a systematic approach where human factors, courage, leadership, tactical skill, became operationally irrelevant. Not because German soldiers lacked these qualities, but because the American system had evolved beyond the level where those qualities could influence operational outcomes. General Eisenhower's report stated, "The Ruhr operation demonstrated that properly applied industrial-age warfare can achieve decisive results with minimal friendly casualties. The key is systematic integration of all combat arms operating at a tempo that prevents effective enemy response." The 500,000 German soldiers who chose surrender hadn't been defeated in conventional battle. They'd been rendered obsolete by a form of warfare that didn't require defeating them, only systematically processing them. That distinction marked the end of warfare as previous generations had understood it. And perhaps it marked the beginning of something we're still grappling with today. What happens when war becomes so systematic, so industrial, so inevitable that human factors cease to matter? The Germans discovered that answer in April 1945. 500,000 of them chose survival over resistance that had become, quite literally, pointless.